Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 795. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about Mayan ruins, active volcanoes, colonial cities, crafts, and hikes as we go to the Central American country of Guatemala.
Know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Let's talk about Guatemala. I'd like to welcome back to the show Susan Metenosky from BrooklynTropicali.com, who's come to talk to us about Guatemala. Susan, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And I invited Susan back because I enjoyed the talk we did on Oaxaca not that long ago, and Susan pitched me Guatemala. So, Susan, what's your connection with Guatemala?
So I've just been several times over the years, and it's a place that just kind of keeps pulling me back in, and I feel like can never kind of get enough of it. I think the first time I went was in 2014 for just about a week and a half trip, and really fell in love. It's such a rich culture and such an interesting place. So when I started traveling full time, I ended up going back again for a longer period for 2-3 weeks. And then since then have been back again and again. So it's just one of those places that there's so much to see and learn and do and hear.
Excellent. And why should someone go to Guatemala?
So I think it's such a diverse place. I think you can do and learn so much in just a week's time. So the country has such a rich culture. Over half the population is indigenous, and the Maya culture is kind of the strongest ethnic group there. However, within the Mayan culture, there's at least 20 or more distinct ethnic groups and languages. So even within that, there's so much diversity and different traditions all over the country. And then also the nature is really diverse as well. You have everything from tropical coasts and rainforests up to super high mountains. There's a volcano, I think that's almost 14,000 feet. Lots of highlands, jungle. There's so much to see and experience. And then also just the history. It has such a long history. There's a really important Mayan archaeological site there to visit. So it really has a little bit of everything for anyone.
Excellent. Well, what kind of itinerary are you going to recommend for us?
So I would recommend for a week's trip to visit 3 different locations. So Tikal, which is that Mayan archaeological site I mentioned. Antigua, which is a colonial city that was once the capital of Guatemala and has amazing architecture and also lots of culture, artisan work. And then Lake Atitlan, which is a huge crater lake that is surrounded by Mayan villages and mountains and volcanoes. So it has a really great mix of nature as well as culture.
So where are we going to start?
So we can start in Flores, which is the jumping off point for Tikal. Just logistically, you do need to arrive in Guatemala City, and then you'll need to book a flight or a bus separately from that. If you can go in the same day, that would be great. If not, you can spend the night in Antigua and then take one of the really early flights to Flores. Flores is a very sweet little town on a lake not too far from Tikal. It's actually a little island and is full of colorful homes. It's really pretty and charming, so it's a great place to base yourself, and there's lots of tour operators there that you can choose your Tikal tour and get that all set up there.
Well, and are you recommending that I wait until I get to Flores to book my tour, or should I do that ahead of time through the internet, or...
For the most part, you can do it while you're there. There are plenty of tour operators and lots of space usually. The only time I would recommend booking ahead is if you're going during a very high season around any of the big holidays, then you might want to check with your hotel about arranging that beforehand.
And you say the big holidays in North America or the big holidays in Guatemala?
So Easter week is probably one of the biggest weeks. So that's definitely the high seasons you want to book ahead. Around Christmas, those are the kind of the 2 big ones that I would definitely want to book ahead.
Excellent. Okay. And so we're going to get to Flores probably, if we're there some other time of year, we're going to walk down the main street and be accosted by 3 different tour operators and book something.
You can also always check with your hotel if you want to get a trusted source of a good tour operator.
And then what should we know in terms of visiting Tikal?
Tikal is a huge site. It's over 200 square miles, so you could spend days there if you wanted to. Most people only do a tour, but it is kind of fairly long tour because there's a lot to see and do and learn. The 2 most popular tours are Sunrise and Sunset Tour. So I would definitely recommend one of them. It's very beautiful to see the sunrise or set over the jungle. Some of the pyramids are quite tall and extend above the jungle. So you can usually kind of sit and watch the sun come up or down, watch the wildlife wake up or go to sleep, and it's really a beautiful experience.
Now, I'm assuming even though the site is 200 square miles, that most of the tourism happens in a much smaller region?
Yeah, you're not walking 200 square miles, thankfully. It is, you do walk quite a bit, but it is more kind of focusing on the most important buildings in the central part of Tikal.
Well, and when you were saying sunrise or sunset are recommended, I was also wondering if that's because we're in the jungle and the middle of the day is might be something we want to avoid from the heat.
It probably is more comfortable as well. The nice thing is that it's quite covered because it's such a dense lush jungle. So there is a lot of shade, but you're right that it will likely be a little bit more comfortable temperature-wise, either sunrise or sunset.
And if I've done some of the Mayan sites in the Yucatan, is this similar to Chichen Itza or Cobá, or is it very, very different? Or
I mean, it is quite different. The closest it would be to like Cobá, because it's in the middle of the jungle, and you can kind of climb up and see over the canopy. Or maybe, I haven't been to Calakmul, but I would assume it's probably quite similar to that as well.
And when you say you can climb up, so unlike, for instance, Chichen Itza, you can climb some of the pyramids.
Yes, some of them. And your guide, will let you know.
Let us know what we can and what we cannot. Yes.
Exactly.
That's what they're there for.
Yes.
And this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, we should also mention, which you've got more than one in the itinerary that you're recommending for us. So,
yeah, Guatemala seems to be full of them for a good reason.
Excellent. You mentioned the sunset. What else are the highlights for Tikal for you?
I will mention, for me, one of the really striking things is just how immersed in nature you are as well. the forest there is so beautiful, and there's so much wildlife. So when I went, we saw spider monkeys and howler monkeys, which is pretty amazing. There are all kinds of tropical birds, parrots. You might see a snake. There are jaguars there, although it's probably not very likely you would see one. But that aspect is really amazing as well. It's quite a rich experience, not just with the history, but also with the nature and wildlife.
Excellent. Is it time to move on?
Sure. So after Flores, you'll want to head back to Antigua, or head to Antigua for the first time, depending on your itinerary. Antigua was the capital of Guatemala for 200 years until it was largely destroyed by an earthquake in the 1700s. At that time, they moved the capital to Guatemala City. That's how Antigua got its name, La Antigua Guatemala. So the old Guatemala.
Okay, sure.
And now it's just referred to as Antigua. It's just a very, very beautiful city. It was very well restored. There's so many historic buildings to see. My favorite activity in Antigua is really just walking the streets with a camera, seeing all of the beautiful buildings. There are a couple ex-convents you can go in and visit that are very beautiful, very interesting architecture. Lots and lots of churches.
Ex-convents, meaning that they've been repurposed for something else or that they are ruins?
So the two that I am speaking of are they're basically museums now.
Got it. Okay.
So you can visit, wander them, see what they looked like. There are others, though, that are actually just ruins. So there's a lot to see.
Is this some place where you recommend that we take a day tour or something as well?
It kind of depends on your travel style.
Sure.
I've generally done just independent walking and kind of looking up buildings. And if you go into any of the buildings that you can visit, there's usually some information that you can look up. But if you would like a walking tour, I'm sure those are available as well. They can kind of give you an overview to start and tell you about the important buildings and give you some context.
And when you say there's information in the buildings, I know your Spanish is better than my Spanish. You've got a little more practice. I don't think we've mentioned in this episode, but you have lived in Latin America for a while now? 5
or 6 years, I think.
So is the information I'm going to find likely to be in English or likely to be in Spanish?
That's a good question.
I'm guessing Spanish.
I can't remember really off the top of my head. I would guess Spanish. You're right. So if you would like context in English and you don't want to just be Googling on your phone, it's probably better to take a walking tour.
Okay. Excellent. What else are we going to do while we're in Antigua?
Sure. So besides sightseeing and the architecture and history, Antigua is full of culture. The artisan work there is really quite amazing. The main artisan work being textiles and weaving.
Okay.
There are many, many shops you can go in and browse and see beautiful huipiles, which are the traditional blouses or dresses that women wear. There's all kinds of other types of textiles, blankets, tablecloths, things like that. So there's lots of that you can see and learn about.
And you say weaving in Central America. I'm getting a mental image here of brightly colored textiles.
Yes.
Okay. Floral patterns and things like that?
A lot of weaving, but then also a lot of embroidery. Mm-hmm. When we go to our next stop in Atitlan, there's weaving and textiles are also very common and important there. And there are some great places we can go to actually see demonstrations of how the weaving's done and natural dyes and things like that. So there we can get some more context on how that tradition works.
Okay.
Besides that, there are a few other things to do in Antigua. There's a place called Cerro de la Cruz that's just a little overlook over the city with a cross, but it has a great view of the city and the valley and then a dramatic view of Volcan de Agua just behind. I should mention also Antigua is surrounded by volcanoes, so it's another reason it's quite picturesque. There are several volcanoes, I believe 3 that are quite close. One that has been active recently, I'm not sure right now, but a couple years ago, you could see kind of smoke billowing out at all times. So
picturesque and wonderful up until the moment that it's not.
Well, that's why the capital had
not
to
here
move.
anymore. Yes.
So yeah, it is beautiful and intimidating.
Well, and you said Cerro de la Cruz, so Hill of the Cross.
Exactly.
Which is why we've got the views.
Yeah.
For those of us who are not as facile in Spanish as you are.
And then speaking of volcanoes, one of the other popular things to do in Antigua is to hike the volcano called Pacaya. And Pacaya is an active volcano, and up until fairly recently, kind of the big attraction with it is that you could see flowing lava.
Okay.
While you hike, which I'm sure is quite a sight. I actually haven't done the hike, but it is quite popular. Right now, I've heard the lava isn't flowing, but the ground is still hot. You can feel it, and they roast marshmallows over it, so I'm sure that's quite interesting. But also, there's a great view.
I should tell people, if you have a chance to go someplace safely, obviously, where there is flowing lava and you can see it in a controlled and supervised environment, it is pretty amazing.
I bet.
To be in front of rock that is so hot that it is liquid and it's 1,500 degrees. I've been close enough to lava, close enough to touch it and smart enough not to.
Oh, good.
3 feet away from lava, and it's pretty amazing. But there are only certain times you'd want to do it.
Yeah.
To get that close.
Yeah. And then finally, the one other thing I definitely would recommend from Antigua, there are some coffee farms that you can visit. Mm-hmm. And Guatemala has amazing, amazing coffee. So it's a great place to learn about coffee growing and how that works. So there's a coffee farm called Finca La Azotea that I would recommend. And they do educational visits, and it's a beautiful site, and it's quite close to the city.
Okay. And I can't translate Finco de Azotea.
The farm of the village.
Oh, okay. Excellent.
And so that's about it. That would very well fill a couple days in Antigua. And then from there, I'd say we're off to Atitlan, which is just about 3 hours away. Lake Atitlan, so it's a huge crater lake. I think I mentioned it was caused by a eruption of a supervolcano about 84,000 years ago.
Oh, no, I don't think you did. Okay.
Okay.
Or maybe you did in the first version of this, just so people know. The first 10 minutes of this, Susan and I had quite a lot of deja vu because we had a technical problem where we lost the recording. So, but okay, interesting.
It actually has a conical shape to it. It's really very deep in the middle. It's very large, and it's surrounded by really steep mountains on all sides, as well as 3 volcanoes. So it's really an incredibly picturesque lake. It's very, very beautiful. And besides that, there are 11 traditional Mayan villages around the lake that you can visit. And they're all quite unique and distinct and have their own traditions and attractions. So part of the appeal for me is just visiting those. The transportation on the lake is generally just boat transportation. So the taxis are basically boat taxis that go from dock to dock. And that's really an interesting way to visit the towns and also to get a really picturesque view of the lake and the towns.
Well, and we should say, so in terms of the itinerary, we started at Tikal in the north in the jungle. And now we've headed to the southern part of the country, southern half of the country. And we're now at elevation. We're now up in the mountains at like a mile up.
Yeah, exactly. So Tikal is lower down. It's tropical, but Antigua and Atitlan are both quite close in elevation. They're around very roughly 5,000 feet.
Okay.
So it's very comfortable temperature, really lovely weather all year long. I think they call it the eternal spring.
Okay.
It's just very comfortable, sunny, warm during the day, a little bit fresh at night, really pleasant.
Bring your sunscreen because you're also close to the equator and at elevation.
Sure.
And a hat. Okay.
But yeah, so for Atitlan, you'll have to decide where you want to stay. There are quite a few options. They're different villages. The most touristed village is called Panajachel. It's a good jumping off point. There are also several others that have become more popular. There's one called San Marcos. That is a traditional village, although it has become quite popular with kind of the wellness community. So there's a lot of yoga and things like that there now. San Pedro is another town that attracts tourists and has more nightlife, attracts more backpacker crowd.
Okay.
And then Santa Cruz is a lovely village that's kind of up on a hill. And then just below it, there are quite a few hotels and hostels. And that's just a really calm, beautiful place. It kind of, if you want to spend more time in nature and have more of kind of a relaxing experience.
And when you say there are hotels, how touristed, and this is one of the more popular spots in Guatemala. So am I going to see international brands for hotels, or am I going to be staying in a local hotel?
I don't think there are any international brands on
Okay.
Atitlan. I don't think I have ever seen any. But there is a variety from every price point and
Hmm.
comfort level. So there's many, many hostels. There's lots of budget travel. There are also some beautiful boutique hotels. There are some retreat centers if you want to do more of yoga retreat or kind of an immersive experience like that.
Okay.
So there's really a little of everything, just depending on what you're looking for.
Ah bon chien. Bonjour, je suis Theo, a tour leader with Explore, and this is Punti. He's helping us find truffles under the trees next to this beautiful vineyard. Maybe for tomorrow's cooking class? We call it Semillon heure. Parfait. Semillon o'clock. Not everyone gets to enjoy a Bordeaux sunset this way, but you will if you explore. No, Punti. Search exploreworldwide.com and don't just travel. Explore.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
Now, it sounds like when you went or have gone, you're doing more of a cultural dive than a existential dive into your meditation or something like that.
Well, one time I did do a retreat
Okay.
at a really beautiful place. There's one place called Via Sumaya that you can choose to do a personal retreat. So you can go and you don't necessarily have to go with a group, and then you can choose to do classes if you want and kind of make your own itinerary. So it's really a flexible experience, which is nice if you're kind of like independent travel as well.
Okay.
So you'll choose which of those villages is where you want to base yourself. And then there's many different types of things you can do during your time there. One of the things I mentioned was the textiles. For me, that was something incredibly interesting because I used to work in fashion, but it is just a very beautiful tradition. The best place I would recommend to go to learn about that on the lake is called San Juan. It's a village. San Juan has many, many women's cooperatives that do weaving, and they can give you a demonstration. The typical weaving there is backstrap loom weaving. So
Okay.
what that is a belt that goes around your back,
Mm-hmm.
hooks to a loom that is then tied to a tree opposite you or a pole.
Right.
So then you weave in front of you, and the backstrap kind of keeps the tension so that you can work on your project. So it's very interesting, and it's many times very intricate and impressive, the work that they do, that they make look very easy. And they also they use natural dyes, and so they'll show
Okay.
you the ingredients that they use to dye the different threads, and a really interesting process. And then, of course, you can buy work from them. And the nice thing about the women's cooperatives is, you know, that the women are getting paid a fair wage,
Right.
and so that's the best place I would recommend.
Yeah, it's wonderful community-based tourism at
Yeah.
that point. Yeah.
So that's a great thing to do on the lake.
And when you say do, I can actually also take a class in this if I want to, not just do a tour, from what you said previously.
I'm sure you can, actually. I haven't, but I'm sure it's offered. So if you ask at your hotel, I'm sure you could find something like that.
Okay.
One of the other very interesting things to do is visit the largest and most traditional market in Guatemala. It's not right on the lake, but it's quite close, so it's an easy day trip. It's called Chichicastenango.
I just laugh because every time something is mentioned on the show, I have to find it and put a link to it in the show notes. And that was one that I wasn't sure I was going to be able to spell it phonetically. But by the time you listen to this, I will have figured it out.
Yeah, I'll send you some
Yeah.
notes. Chichicastenango. So it's an incredible market. It's bustling and frantic and busy and just full of regular everyday life. So, of course, you can find all the things you would find in a normal local market in Latin America. So there's fresh produce and prepared foods. There are many, many beautiful textiles there because that is the big artisan work in Guatemala. So you can find almost any kind of textile there that you might be looking for. There are also many vintage textiles, which are quite beautiful and interesting.
Oh, interesting. Huh.
So definitely recommend it as a cultural experience. The center of the market is this beautiful church where they're always burning incense. There's a flower market in front, and it's just a really interesting cultural experience.
Okay. And I see pictures of the church decorated with, I don't even know what to call streamers, I guess would be.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah. It's really beautiful, and it's a really interesting specific experience that I kind of haven't, even though I've been all over Latin America, that church and kind of the experience and the ambiance around it, I haven't quite seen anywhere else.
Okay. Interesting. Saint Santo Tomas Chichicastenango.
Chichicastenango.
Just like it sounds.
Or Chichi. I think a lot of people call it Chichi for short.
I could understand why they might. Okay.
So yeah, that's a great day tour. It's on Thursdays and Sundays.
Okay.
Another beautiful place to visit on the lake is called Santa Catarina Palapo. It's a traditional town, but fairly recently they've started an initiative to paint murals all over the town, hundreds and hundreds of buildings. So the idea is their economy was kind of struggling a bit, and so they wanted to be able to increase tourism, job opportunities, and it's really very, very beautiful. They use traditional motifs that you would also find on textiles, and each family gets to obviously choose what kind of motifs and colors they want to paint on their home. And it's just a really interesting community initiative and a beautiful place to visit.
Now, I don't know what should be picturing when you say traditional motifs that be used on textiles.
So a lot of geometric.
Okay, because that's what I think of with textiles. Okay.
Yeah, geometric shapes and designs, a lot of bright colors, they have a lot of blues and turquoise on the walls.
Okay.
It's very beautiful, and they also have quite a few textiles there as well. So while you're walking around and taking pictures or admiring, you can stop and shop for some textiles as well.
Now, how many days of our itinerary would you dedicate to the lake? It seems like there's quite a lot to see here.
So if you only have a week, I would say Flores, Tikal, you do for about 1 to 2 days, depending on your logistics.
Right.
You can kind of do it in one day, but you might need a little more time to get there and back.
Right.
Antigua, 2 full days should be sufficient, and then the rest of the time in Atitlan. So at least 3 days, I would say.
Okay.
There is a lot to do. It's kind of spread out. You'll want to try to give yourself some time if you can.
Got it.
One other thing to enjoy the nature in Atitlan is a sunrise hike to a mountain peak called Mayan's Nose. So obviously sunrise hike, so you leave
You leave in the dark.
well before the sun rises. You travel through dark villages and then you hike up. It's not a very long hike. I think it's about 30 to 45 minutes, although it is total incline the whole time. You have to kind of rely on your guide to show you where to go because there's very little light to no light. But once you get to the top, you get to watch the sunrise over the lake with all of the dramatic peaks and volcanoes surrounding it. It's very, very beautiful. It's striking and dramatic and well worth getting out of bed before sunrise.
You've convinced me, but I think I'd have trouble convincing my wife. But
the colors that you see in the sky and then reflected from the lake, it's really quite beautiful.
Yeah, I think I've only done one sunrise hike like that when I was in India, and it's a wonderful experience.
Yeah, it is. It's very peaceful. And it's very interesting seeing a place wake up, I think. Other than that, there's just lots of exploring villages. Like I mentioned, there is a lot of wellness type of activities that go on there. So if you like yoga, there's lots of yoga classes, massage, self-care kinds of things are definitely an option. Those are the big things around Atitlan.
Now, obviously, every time I ask people to put together a 1-week itinerary, which is what we kind of target in this show, you have to choose from so many different options. Some you choose because you like these 3 better than those 3, and some you choose because you specifically don't want people to go there. Is there anything in Guatemala where you're recommending we don't do?
I would just say with any kind of cultural tourism, you want to be aware of what you're invited to and what you're not. So I think if you want to observe the local culture, the best thing to do would be to find a reputable tour that can bring you to an experience that locals are comfortable with you joining and showing you. instead of kind of inserting yourself into an experience or kind of being a voyeur, I guess.
And are you thinking of specific instances where you have seen this behavior in tourists in Guatemala?
A lot of people like to take pictures of people while they travel. Sure. And I understand, but at the same time, it's probably the most polite thing to do to ask if it's okay. And then also just kind of people who maybe are too curious and want to kind of wander into or look inside people's homes or things like that, where we should be respectful and only be doing things like that if we're invited.
Sure. I understand the curiosity, but
yeah,
I don't want people walking into my house.
Right, exactly. And I know there are things like cacao ceremonies, that cacao is a big part of Mayan culture.
Sure.
So there are things like that you can do through a tour, which I would recommend. If you're interested, you should definitely try to find a reputable tour that can let you share in that experience in a respectful way.
As you narrowed this down to 1 week, what was the one thing that it made you sad that you couldn't include?
Oh, there's so many other things in Guatemala. So one place that I did manage to do on one of my trips is called Sumuk Shempe.
Okay.
It's deep in the jungle in the middle of Guatemala. And so the tricky thing about it is it just takes so long to get there.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I took a tourist shuttle, which are usually fairly fast, as far as like faster than a local bus. And I took that from Lake Atitlan, I think it was about 8 hours. And then on our way back, we went to Guatemala City. I think that was about 12 hours, although that was definitely due to some traffic as well.
Okay.
It's an isolated place, but it's very beautiful. It's a series of turquoise pools that kind of cascade down one by one in the middle of the jungle. So bright turquoise, just really striking and beautiful, surrounded by really lush jungle. So for that, the attraction is there's a little hike you can do up to a viewpoint and see over, and it's just this gorgeous aerial view of the pools. And then after that, you're going to be very hot and sweaty. So then you go down and jump in the pools and swim, and then you can kind of jump one by one down through the pools. There's also tubing and things like that. It's a very beautiful, special place, but it's just takes quite a bit of time out of your itinerary to get there.
It reminds me of the Guatemalan version of the park in Plitvice in Croatia with that kind of color pools and little waterfalls and things like that, except in a jungle and not in a deciduous forest.
Right.
Looks gorgeous, but not easy to get to, you say?
Not easy to get to. If you have a longer itinerary, it's great to fit in, but for only a week, it would be really tough.
Okay, excellent. Anything else we want to cover in the itinerary before we get to some of our wrap-up questions?
I'll just mention a couple other places that are kind of the highlights of Guatemala that I couldn't fit into this itinerary, but that are very interesting. The second largest city in Guatemala is called Quetzaltenango, or it's called Xela for short. And so the big attraction there's a lot of hiking, and in particular, that tallest volcano that I mentioned in the country, that's almost 14,000 feet. You can hike that. It's the highest peak in Central America, actually. The popular hike is a 2-day hike where you camp overnight and then watch the sunrise. And I have not done it. I would like to, but it sounds amazing. Everyone I know who's done it says it was one of their favorite experiences they've ever done. You can see all the way to the Pacific, just above the clouds, panoramic views. So it sounds like a beautiful experience.
Okay. And that's the Santa Maria volcano?
That is Tajumuco.
Okay.
Santa Maria. That's another one that you can hike.
Got it.
I don't believe that's the one that is the most popular one.
Oh, okay. Excellent.
And then other than that, there's also on the Eastern Caribbean side, a very distinct culture. So Rio Dulce and Livingston are kind of the two bigger tourist destinations there. And there you'll find Afro-Caribbean culture. So completely different from the rest of the country, really different food, different language, and also the nature is quite different. It's very jungly and coastal, obviously.
Excellent.
The only other kind of big popular spot is a beach town called Peredon that's become a hotspot for surfing. So if you're a big surfer, that's a good place to stop. That's on the Pacific side.
Okay. Excellent. As we start to wrap this up, you're standing in the prettiest spot Let's do the prettiest spot in Guatemala first. Doesn't have to be on this itinerary. Where would that be? Where are you standing? What are you looking at?
I would say, for me, Atitlan is incredible.
Okay.
So I would say standing at Mine's Nose for sunrise, watching the sun come up over the lake and seeing all the colors and reflections.
Excellent. And one thing that makes you laugh and say only in Guatemala.
So chicken buses are a big thing in Central America in general, and quite common in Guatemala. And so if you're not familiar with what those are, they're usually old school buses that come from the US or Canada that they paint in these incredible colors with all the bells and whistles. They're just very interesting looking.
No two alike.
No two alike. And they just are the regular transportation. So people ride them. They're never too full. You can fit infinite amount of people on there.
And chickens.
And chickens. And they're so vibrant and just kind of fun to watch. And I don't know, it's just such a Guatemala thing for me.
Now, I'm curious, as someone who is fluent in Spanish, when you get on the chicken bus, are you making friends with people and interacting with people? How approachable are people in Guatemala if language is not a barrier?
I think people in Guatemala are very warm and kind for the most part. If you want to make friends and if you want to chat with people, I think people will be open to it. I mean, definitely give it a shot if you're an extrovert and you want to get to know people. If they don't respond, then you have your answer. But in general, I think people are quite warm and open, and I've just found people in Guatemala to be lovely.
Excellent. If you had to summarize Guatemala in just 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Can I use 4 and say rich culture and natural beauty?
As someone who is an alumni, this is your second interview, yes, you can have a bonus word.
Great.
Or we can hyphenate one of those.
Okay, perfect.
Our guest again has been Susan Metenosky from BrooklynTropicali.com. And Susan, if we wanted to send people to your best post on Guatemala, where are we going to send them?
So I actually do have an itinerary for 1 week as a post. So it is called Guatemala Itinerary 1 Week Guatemala Trip. And it includes these 3 locations. So that would be a good place to kind of gather that info.
Excellent, excellent. We will put a link to that in the show notes as well as in the lyrics of this episode. Susan, thanks so much for coming back on Amateur Traveler and for sharing with us your love for Guatemala.
Thanks so much for having me. It's always fun to chat with you.
Special thanks to the patrons of the show who help support the show both financially and for me a little emotionally, because it helps to have some support in weeks that are tough, and this was one of those. And special thanks to our latest patron, and special thanks to Peter, who is our latest patron. If you're interested in supporting the show, you can go to patreon.com/amateurtraveler. Speaking of patrons, we had a discussion during the Zoom call we had last Saturday, our monthly Zoom call that we do with the patrons of the show, about the enhanced version of the show. Actually, the whole show is enhanced now, has photos and links, and one of our well-known patrons didn't know how to access that, thought that they weren't there anymore. And so you have to have the right app that you're listening to a podcast with. I use Downcast on the iPhone to listen to podcasts. I'm told there's also support in Overcast, Pocket Casts, Antenna Podcastro, Player FM, and the Apple Podcast app as well. If you have one of those apps, then while you're listening to the show, there are photos of every place we're talking about and also clickable links that you can click through to get to the places that we're talking about. And I at least want to bring it up periodically to let people know that that exists. And if you're not seeing it with where you're listening to the show, there might be a better place to get to. Now, if you're in the car, don't be looking at the photos. So that's only for those of you who are listening sometime when they're available. But I know some people will listen to the show and then they'll go back and look at some of the photos. So I do want to bring it up and make sure that you know that that is an option. We spend a lot of time putting in those, and so I hope you can take advantage of that and find some value from that. I should also say that I checked this week and there are still some openings if you want to join me for the trip to Turkey in September. More information about that at amateurtraveler.com/Turkey 2022. So if you would care to join me, I think we're going to have a fun time, whether or not you do, but I don't want you to miss out. With that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more.